The lookup feature is used to facilitate the entry of data in a foreign key field. Now, what exactly do I mean by this? We're about to create an orders table, which will have a customer ID. The customer ID in the orders table is going to be the foreign key, in that it's looked up within the customers table, and that customer ID is the primary key in that customers table. I'm going to close the customers table, and I'm going to create another table in design view. This table is going to have an order ID, which is going to be an auto number, and it's going to act as the primary key. It's also going to have an order date, and the order date is going to be a date time field. I'm now going to insert a field between the order ID and the order date. I'm going to click right here and insert a field. I'm going to enter the name of the field, which is actually company ID. And this is going to be a number field, and it needs to be a long integer since it needs to be compatible with the field on the primary side of the relationship. Now, rather than selecting number, though, instead, I'm going to select Lookup Wizard. I select Lookup Wizard, and the Lookup Wizard launches. The first question the Lookup Wizard asks me is whether I want the lookup column to look up the values in a table or query, or whether I'm going to type the values that I want. I want it to look up the values in a table or query. In fact, I want it to look up those values in the customers table. I'm going to click Next. I'm going to select TBL Customers, which is the only other table in the database, and I'm going to click Next. What I want to have appear in my lookup is the company ID and the company name. The company ID is what's actually going to be stored within the orders table, whereas the company name is what the user is going to see. Clicking Next, I go to the next step. I'm going to hide the key column that contains the company ID, and all the user is going to see is the company name. I'm going to double-click right here to auto-size the column based on the longest entry that's currently in the column. And I'm going to click Next. The label that I'm going to give is just plain old company. I'm going to click Finish, and notice that I'm told that the table must be saved before the relationships can be created. I'm going to save it and establish the relationships. Saving the table, I'm going to call this TBL Orders, once again following naming conventions, and I'm going to click OK. Notice that Access automatically changed the data type to number, as I said it would, and the field size is long integer. Going to Datasheet, though, we'll look at the fruits of our efforts. Clicking to Datasheet view, if I go over to the company, I get a combo box, and I can select any of the values from the combo box, and of course specify an order date as well. Go to the next record, and I can do the same thing. If I don't want this 0 to appear, I just simply need to change the default value for that field and make it so that it's not 0. I can select any company and enter any order date I want and continue on adding records to my table. So you've seen the benefit of the lookup feature. In addition to being able to establish field properties, you can also establish table properties. Whereas field properties apply to a specific field, table properties apply to the table as a whole. To establish table properties, you switch to design view of a table. I'm going to close the orders table, and I'm going to go back to the customers table within design view. If we take a look, if I click the Properties tool on the toolbar, notice that I can set properties for the entire table. A table has a description, a validation rule and validation text, filter, order by, a sub-data sheet name, link child fields, link master fields, sub-data sheet height, and sub-data sheet expanded. A sub-data sheet allows you to see the related records within a child table. If I go right now into TBL Customers in Datasheet view, notice that automatically we get some plus signs. If I click the plus sign for any of these companies, I can see any orders associated with that company. Notice that, for example, Dan's Basketball Club has an order. Alexis's Toys does not, Gregory's Movies does, and another company does as well. I'm going to go back to the design of this TBL customers table. And if I did not want to have a sub-data sheet, rather than selecting auto, I could select none. Clicking save and going to datasheet view, you can see that I do not get any pluses. Going back to design view, if I change this to auto, I can do something like this. I can specify that the sub-data sheet automatically appears expanded. Clicking save again and going back to datasheet view, not only do I have sub-data sheets, but you can see that they automatically appear in expanded format. So those are some of the table properties that I can set. I'm going to set this back to no. Another important table property is a validation rule property. Setting the validation rule for the table allows me to span my validation over multiple fields in the table. So in other words, if the rule for one field affects the rule for another field. So let's take a look at how we can enter a validation rule for the table. I'm going to enter a validation rule that controls the credit limit based upon the state. The validation rule that I'm going to enter is that the state, if the state is in California or New York, I can enter the quotes or else they'll be entered for me, and the credit limit is less than or equal to 2,500, that's okay. Or, and I'm going to Shift F2 to zoom so we can see this better, I'm also going to place the state field in brackets to ensure that this is read properly. So my second part of the validation is going to say if the state is in this case, Massachusetts or Arizona, and the credit limit is less than or equal to 3,500, that's going to be okay. And finally, if the state is not in California, New York, Massachusetts, or Arizona, then we're not going to do anything special in testing the credit limit. So what I've done here is I've combined more than one field in my validation, and that wouldn't be possible by establishing separate validation rules, since you cannot control the order in which people enter data into the different fields. So let's see how this works. And notice I get a message saying that I have invalid syntax. Well, I notice right here I accidentally did not type not, I typed no. Let's see if that was it, and in fact that was. So let's go ahead and save, and again I get a message saying that the data integrity rules have been changed. Do I want to check existing data with these rules? And I'm going to click yes. And we can see that some of our existing data must violate these rules. So again, we need to run queries to test for that. And what I'm going to do is go into Datasheet View and try adding a new record. This record that I'm going to add is just going to be called something. I need to enter something into the phone number just because it's required. But what's important is that we're looking at the state. The state on this record is going to be California. And remember, if the state is California, the credit limit needs to be less than or equal to 2,500. I'm going to put in 4,000, which ordinarily would be a valid credit limit. Remember, the validation rule for the credit limit is that it needs to be between 0 and 5,000. But if I go to move off of this, you can see that one or more values are prohibited by the validation rule, state in California, New York, and so forth. Now, I could have entered my own validation text, and I didn't do that. And of course, I'd want to go back and do that. Let's change this to 2,500. And now, no problem. Now let's try changing the state. We tested California. Let's try changing the state to Massachusetts. Our rule here was the credit limit needs to be less than 3,500. If I go with 4,000, I get the same message. But on the other hand, if I change it to 3,500, you can see that it works fine. Now what if I enter a state It is not California, New York, Massachusetts, or Arizona. The other valid state I can enter is Utah. Now for Utah, I'm going to try to enter a credit limit of $4,500. No problem. So the only problem I would have with Utah is if I, for example, tried to enter $5,500. Since remember, our credit limit validation says that the credit limit needs to be between 0 and 5,000. Now you can see I get a different error message. So anything that's between 0 and 5,000 is going to be acceptable for Utah. So I've actually combined two fields in order to determine my criteria.